Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me for our next Lifestyle Medicine Master Series. Today's topic is a nutrition deep dive, inflammation, phytonutrients, and the power of plants. In our Lifestyle Medicine 101 course, we talked about the health benefits of a plant predominant diet. So if you didn't watch that video, I will go briefly over some details here, but there are many more details and sources and explanations in that video. So I would encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and watch the Lifestyle Medicine 101 Nutrition PowerPoint to see more about the premise and basis of what we're talking about today. But today we're going to take a deeper dive into why plants are so healthy. We'll learn how to know what foods are high quality, discuss the premise behind inflammation that happens from the standard American diet, and then learn the basics of phytonutrients. So here's our outline for today. We're going to start with a Lifestyle Medicine 101 nutrition recap. Then we'll talk about inflammation, what it is, why it matters. Then we'll dive into the power of plants and end with a little bit on intermittent fasting. I wanted to add this because it comes up often in conversation and it's a very hot topic with some potential health benefits. So I wanted to just be sure we touched on it briefly. In Lifestyle Medicine 101, we went over something called the Standard American Diet, which the acronym for is SAD. And I must say that the Standard American Diet is quite sad. You don't have to go far to find highly processed foods that don't resemble where their original source was, that have added salts and sugars and fats that are unnecessary. And it's not uncommon that people ask, how do I eat healthy when we live in a world where everywhere I turn are quote unquote unhealthy foods? And so this slide gives a great example of the Standard American Diet. So if you look at the bottom, this is from 2015 because everything is delayed usually by at least 5 years because it's a 5-year time period for gathering data. And so this data was gathered starting in 2020. So this is the most recent data we have now. And so in 2015, this looked at the scores for what would be considered a high quality diet. And this is on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being no nutritional value and 100 being the best nutritional value. And so our current score is 59. This graph on the left shows where we've been for the last 15 years, or I guess 10 years from a slide standpoint. And we've really been just hovering in the same place. We've gone up a little bit. So 56 was the low, 60 was the high, and we're currently at 59. So this is based on a big questionnaire that looks at the types of foods that are consumed on a regular basis. And they also break it down by age group. And so you can see that the youngest kids actually have one of the highest scores at 61, and that the quality of the food being consumed by age group declines during adolescence, so during a very crucial time in development, and then slowly improves as people get older, with the best score being 64 in older adults. Sorry, my image is cutting it off, but that's 65 and older. In 64, well, the highest score is really not that ideal. It still is far from 100. So, we're at 2/3 or 64% of a quality diet. Usually people don't brag about being 64%. And so this slide suggests that our standard American diet still has a lot of work to do. And so when they're looking at this, they're looking at the types of foods that we're eating and how processed they are. So these scores are reflected because the biggest consumption of food in our country tends to be processed snack items and sandwich type foods. And so when we're not cooking things from scratch and eating things that resemble the source of where they came from, the nutritional value deteriorates. And so when we were in Lifestyle Medicine 101, we talked about this standard American diet, and then we talked about an alternative, which can be called a whole food plant predominant or whole food plant-based diet. The extreme of this would be a vegan diet, which some of the studies did study, but isn't necessarily required to get the high quality. The point is that the more whole foods we consume, the higher our scores will be. And so if we're able to consume 80% of our foods as plant predominant and still have 20% that come from animal products, we still could have a score potentially of 80. And not saying that animal products have no nutritional value by any means, but I'm saying if the foods we're consuming are so high quality and minimally processed, even if we add in less high quality items, we can still get to a much higher score. And so this slide explains why this change is needed. And in Lifestyle Medicine 101, Alexandra Lesson went into some of the studies that have actually showed disease reversal for individuals with heart disease and diabetes who adopt a more plant-predominant diet. And so our goal with this presentation today is to give you more information on how to eat more fruits and vegetables and whole grains. So these are some of the highlights from the last presentation. And again, plants are key. So the studies that we talk about show that eating more plants is linked with improved blood sugar control with diabetes, improved cardiovascular health. They've actually found reversal of plaque buildup. So basically people had plaque on their arteries in their heart. They just changed their diet and lifestyle. They then went back and re-scanned to see if those plaques had progressed, and they did not. They actually reverted depending on the type of diet they were following. So improved cardiovascular health, lower rates of cancer, improved gene integrity and protection against disease. So this one has to do with whenever we have some sort of stressor, our bodies, our genes can be modified from those. And so it's called epigenetics, which is another hot term. And so they found that people who eat a more plant-predominant diet actually have better gene integrity, so it can withstand some of the negative breakdown of genes that can occur, and can also potentially reduce the risk of some of the negative epigenetic changes from happening. Having a longer life expectancy, the blue zones are popular for this. If you haven't heard of them, a quick Google search will give you a documentary, I'm sure. Improved weight control, better mood, more energy, and a higher quality of life. So the standard American diet is linked with higher levels of inflammation. This has been found in mouse studies and then also in human studies where they measure inflammatory markers. The specific components of the standard American diet that are linked with this include saturated fat, trans fat, processed carbohydrates, and things like added sugars. So sugar kind of goes in with the processed carbohydrates. So a note on these things, so saturated fats are only found in animal products, which is why the plant-predominant diet sort of began, because the thought was if we reduce the saturated fat, we'll improve overall well-being and decrease disease. You can find saturated fat in plants rarely. So coconut oil is one of the natural occurring saturated fats. It is, you can know something's a saturated fat because it's solid at room temperature. However, coconut oil is a shorter chain saturated fat and is not necessarily linked with the same adverse effects of the longer chain animal saturated fats, just to keep in mind. Trans fats, there are a small amount that are naturally occurring, but most of them are created in a lab and have largely been banned once we realized how horrible they were for everyone. And so these, what they were doing was taking liquid fats, like oils, and modifying them to change the way that they bond with each other so that they were solid at room temperature. So trans has to do with a chemical configuration. And so we frequently don't see them anymore, and products are not allowed to have more than 0.5 grams of trans fat. However, if that's 0.5 grams per serving, so it's always important to pay attention to labels. If you see anything that says hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, that's how they make the trans configuration. And so you should assume that product has trans fat, even if it's not listed, because often a serving size is like 2 cookies and you might have 8 cookies. And so they only have to list the trans fat if the per serving is 0.5 grams. So it could be 0.4 grams. But then if you consume 4 servings, you have 1.6 grams, which is not an insignificant amount. So trying to avoid things whose labels say hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated are important. Processed carbohydrates are really any grain product, or carbohydrate typically are grains. There's also fruits and other things I'll talk about, but any grain product that is changed from its initial form. So barley is a great example of a whole grain. It's in its whole form. You boil it in water to let it soften, and then you eat it like that, as opposed to flour, which is processed. So that's where the grain is ground up and made into a fine flour that can then be baked for other things. And It's not to say that you can't consume any processed carbohydrates. Just important to note that even if it's a whole grain, if it's been ground up and processed, it's not necessarily as healthy as eating the whole original grain. And there could be some levels of inflammation that are caused from consuming that processed item. I also understand the reality that we can't avoid all processed grains forever. It would be very challenging to eat in America if you never consumed a processed grain. So it's really paying attention to how many we're having in a daily routine, and when we have a choice, trying to choose things that aren't processed or are less processed. And with the sugar piece, so added sugar has an inflammatory component if it's too much sugar for our bodies in a sitting. And we want to be sure that we are trying to not add sugar if we can avoid it, or if we're adding sugar, having it be in a more natural way. So if you're making oatmeal in the morning and you wanted to add some raisins to that oatmeal and maybe add some cinnamon and some applesauce, the sweetness from the apples and from the raisins, as long as they're not with added sugar, will provide you the sweetness, while also giving you other nutritional benefits from the fruit without causing the excessive inflammation that can happen from just added sugar. In addition, excess body fat can cause inflammation. This is typically what's called central adiposity. And so if fat is stored in the abdomen, which tends to be more common in men than women before menopause, and then after menopause with the hormone changes, tends to become more common in women as well. And so when fat is stored in the abdomen, it actually releases releases hormones that can be pro-inflammatory. And so we need to be cautious and cognizant that excess body fat is metabolically active, and this is a potential complication from that. And then inflammation is actually a key driver in many chronic diseases, and it tends to be a cycle. So like diabetes, you have excess sugar, which then leads to insulin resistance eventually, which then leads to more sugar in the blood, which leads to more insulin resistance. Then let's say you have, inflammation from the dietary choices you may be making that are further contributed, and it becomes this endless cycle that seems impossible to break at times. Heart disease is largely from an inflammatory process with the plaque deposition, the plaque rupture, and the further plaque buildup that can develop. And so this process the disease process is inflammatory in nature, plus pro-inflammatory conditions exacerbate the disease process. Things like stroke and dementia, cancer, and sometimes even pain can be driven by an inflammatory process. And so it's important that we are paying attention to these symptoms and evaluating, could our diet potentially help what we're also doing with medications or other interventions with our providers. Inflammation is a normal process in our body. It's been there since the start of time, and it's our body's response to insult or a stressor. So acute inflammation happens with a cut, we'll say. So you have a cut that's bleeding. Your body becomes on alert. It sends inflammatory pieces to that cut to try to heal the cut and prevent you from re-injuring it so it can be protected. So that cut gets swollen, the bleeding ends up stopping. That area is very sticky. The clot is sticky to keep the blood in place and not have you bleed out. And the inflammation is sent to that area so that if you touch it, it hurts, so you'll leave that area alone. So this is a positive response, what we want in order to heal and survive. These inflammatory markers that are released, again, are serving an important purpose. So cytokines are these inflammatory markers that, again, are called to action. So when we have a lower grade stressor, so maybe we don't have a big gaping cut on our arm that's bleeding, but instead we have lack of sleep, we have chronic stress in our life, we have trauma that's unhealed, we're struggling with mental illness. All these things are stressors on our body, and our bodies really can't tell the difference between a physical stressor like having a cut or being in some kind of accident from a physiologic stressor like lack of sleep, poor diet, having significant life stress impacting you. Our bodies don't know the difference. And these stressors tend to be lower grade. They're not as acute and alert as a large accident, But what can happen is if there's this increased activation from chronic stress on a daily basis, then some of these natural inflammatory processes can go awry and can cause approaches to aspects of our body that we don't want. So things related to the disease as above. So, you could have genes that are being modified because our bodies are under stress and think that they need to be doing these epigenetic changes. And so this thought about inflammation is challenging to measure and does have studies behind it. But we think of it more theoretically, so we don't typically measure these inflammatory markers because it's challenging to measure how much quote-unquote inflammation a person has. Autoimmune conditions are another example that they're very true disease, but inflammation impacts how they present and how they respond. And you can not go very far to hear, you can hear stories of people who have an autoimmune condition that are doing all the right things, but they're still having symptoms. And when they adopt lifestyle approaches that decrease inflammation and decrease stress, they notice an improvement in their symptoms. And so that is a component of the appropriate treatment. And so plants themselves actually have innate anti-inflammatory components within them. These are parts of plants that are there so that the plant can survive in nature. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those. So eat the rainbow. I think this slide is amazing. I mean, looking at this picture, doesn't it not make you want to eat everything you see there? And that's so much of what we try to do when we talk about healthy eating, is that if you can make it look good, people want it. And so just imagine if you are deciding to make a healthy lifestyle change and your family's not really on board, but then you show up with this beautiful platter of food from the rainbow, and you can't help but be intrigued and want to eat the different items on it, or at least try it. So we're going to talk a little bit about the power of plants because there are specific things in plants that can cause health benefits. And so they've tried studying what makes plants the color that they are. These are called phytonutrients. And so when you look at a plant's color, you can see the phytonutrients. Now, sometimes there are multiple phytonutrients in plants, and one has a predominant color, especially when you think about things like yellow and tan. That might be a little less obvious that they're there. But we want to try to think about how we can try to eat the rainbow because it gives us health benefits from all of these different components. And so red foods, we have lycopene and anthocyanin. And actually with lycopene, if you cook things, so like tomatoes that are cooked, are more bioavailable. But these red foods protect against prostate, breast, and skin cancer, and they also reduce the risk of heart attacks. Orange foods, the main phytonutrients in those are beta-carotene and bioflavonoids. So beta-carotene is what makes our vision as great as it is, and it's what becomes vitamin A. And so it helps us see in the dark and help with regular vision, everyday vision as well. And it helps support our immune system. Bioflavonoids can reduce the risk of heart attacks and cancer and help us maintain strong bones and skin. They are interesting because cooking can lower their availability at times, and so it can be tricky. The main key typically with all of these foods is you don't want to overcook anything, and in general, eating them raw is fine. If it's a food that you can tolerate raw, sometimes foods taste better. Some foods taste better cooked. The only one with cooking particularly highlighted is the red lycopene. Then lutein and zeaxanthin. And so these are helpful because they are also cancer-fighting agents and have significant antioxidant properties. They also may help with vision as well. Green are glucosinolates, phytosterols, and I always say this one wrong, catechins. And so the glucosinolates are cruciferous vegetables, and these have great data for help against breast and uterine cancer. Phytosterols, you may have heard of, I think it was called Benecol, but there was a butter that came out that had phytosterols in it. And what they do is they help lower LDL cholesterol. So phytosterols, again, in the green category, are helping lower your cholesterol, and the catechins can potentially reduce breast cancer risk. Blue, black, and purple have resveratrol and, I'm going to butcher this one, pterostilbene. Please forgive me how I butchered that one. But so the resveratrol promotes healthy aging, reduces blood sugars, and can reduce cardiovascular risk. There's actually an entire diet called the MIND diet, which is basically a Mediterranean diet with extra fruits in it that are blue, black, purple because of these specific chemicals and their ability to promote memory. And they have been seen to help with healthy aging and potentially reduce decline with memory. The pterostilbene might also help with cognition, lower LDL, and reduce cancer risk. And then tan, brown, and white are often overlooked because we think, oh, all white things are bad. That's not necessarily true. Obviously, processed carbohydrates are not healthy for us, as I've mentioned before. But there are components that are tan, brown, and white that are healthy. So lignans are antioxidants and phytoestrogens that can support the cardiovascular system, reduce cancer risk, and reduce the risk of hormone-related cancers, specifically breast and prostate cancer. And so, the allicin also has some potential cancer-reducing risk factors. So as you can see, there are numerous components of plants that have health benefits. A tricky piece is that you cannot isolate these and take them as a pill. They've tried that. The China study was this healthy diet, and they thought they figured it out. If they just give people a few supplements like that mimicked what was found in that study for being cancer prevention and health promoting and heart disease prevention, they assumed that if they gave those same nutrients to people in a pill form, that they would see the same results, and they don't. And so this is commonly found in studies and makes it difficult to do nutrition studies because these things are beneficial when they're consumed as the whole food. And so that's why we talk about eating the rainbow. And I added an awesome website I actually just found at the time of this recording called Kids Eat in Color. And it basically talks to you about how you can talk to kids, or even helpful for us as adults, about the health benefits of different foods based on their colors. It's pretty fun, and she has some great free downloads and resources, and she's a registered dietitian. So some of the top 10 foods loaded with antioxidants, again, these are the phytonutrients. And so blackberries, walnuts, strawberries, artichokes, cranberries, raspberries, blueberries, cloves, which I found to be interesting. That's a lot of ground cloves. I can't imagine someone's consuming that many, but maybe they are. If they're making some sort of curry or something, maybe they throw it in there. Prunes, and then red cabbage. Any food with the color that's naturally occurring has some of these phytonutrients. So these are just an example for a 3.5 ounce serving. And then I wanted to briefly talk about intermittent fasting. We're technically already over, and so if you were just doing the 20-minute nutrition video, you're welcome to stop now if you're not interested in learning a little bit about this. But intermittent fasting has become a very big trend recently. The theory is that the meal timing and intermittent periods of not eating are physiologic, and they go along with our circadian rhythm. We used to have periods of fasting when we were cave people back in the day, and that we should be reinstating that into our daily living now. In addition, there's a thought that the periods of fasting allow for resensitization of insulin and utilization of fat storage. And so when we are always having food in our system and never enough time for our body to break down the stores that it put there, we'll have excess stores, and that can cause inflammation because, again, excess fat has inflammatory properties to it. And so this graphic, which is a little small, I hope you can see, shows the circadian rhythm in the middle. And then it talks about how this influences our gut microbiome and how our gut microbiome influences our circadian rhythm. And then also it talks about our modifiable lifestyle factors that can influence our circadian rhythm. And then intermittent fasting is right there on the side. So it's saying that this can influence all of these things together. And then when we take these components together, that's where we get to the metabolic level, where there's inflammation, insulin levels, cholesterol levels, and then satiety, I believe is, satiety, sorry, it's very small print on my screen too, satiety hormones. And then those things play into the chronic diseases that are riddling our current healthcare system. And so types of fasting vary. There are many types out there. The most studied types are these three kinds: time-restricted feeding, which means you only eat during a certain time of the day; a 5-2 method, which means that you consume regular diet 5 days a week, and then 2 days a week you only consume 500 calories a day; or every other day fasting, where you just alternate. One day you eat and one day you don't. Typically 500 calories or less is considered fasting on these diets, and so people will often drink liquids throughout the day and have small items to consume. So the data is very mixed. I wanted to give you all the spiel I typically tell people, and I think that for the most part, a physiologic time-restricted feeding pattern is probably the healthiest way of eating there is, and it doesn't need to be extreme. Obviously, if you start to notice health benefits by making your window smaller, you could by all means do that. But basically what I tell people is our bodies have normal hormone surges for digesting and processing the food we eat, starting earlier in the day. And typically by midday, that's sort of where things peak and they start to taper off and settle down for the evening. And so I usually tell people it would be ideal if you could try to start with a 16-hour window, which would mean you eat for 16 hours a day and you don't eat for 8. So if we're all sleeping for 8 hours, which we should be, this is an easy way to start. And so you can see how if you first prioritize your sleep, the next part becomes easier. Then after they've been able to make it so, because some people will be, and this might be you, stay up late doing projects and you find yourself snacking because you're hungry, and maybe you're only getting 6 hours of sleep and you eat at midnight and then you eat again around 6 or 6:30 in the morning when you get up before you go to work. So instead, what I would encourage people is to make sure you're sleeping the 8 hours. Then from the time you go to bed, you start working backwards and trying to eat further from bedtime. Ideally, the studies look at people who get to somewhere between an 8 to 12 hour fasting window. Typically 8 hours seems to have the most benefit, but really the studies are quite mixed. And so anyone who tells you there's an end-all be-all way to this, I would disagree with them politely and say this is quite individual. The goal is not to starve people, but really just to allow our bodies the time that our bodies need to detoxify and reset and get ready to process the food the next day. And there also are data that show eating too close to bedtime can result in, especially carbohydrates close to bedtime, can result in less restful sleep. So again, I encourage people to always eat in the morning. You don't have to eat the second you get up, but within 2 hours of waking. So by 8 o'clock or so, 8 or 9, depending when you get up, to eat something, and then continue to eat throughout the day, and then have your goal to be stopping in the early evening. So you could see how you could potentially eat breakfast at 9, lunch around 12 or 1, and then dinner around 5 o'clock. And if you're able to fit this in, you could easily get into this window that I was mentioning that studies have found great benefits for. So again, I don't tell people to do all or nothing very quickly. So an 8-hour window is a pretty tight window and can be quite difficult to follow. And so I usually tell people to see where they are right now, and then just do 1 hour, stop eating 1 hour earlier at night, and see how that feels. That might be great. You might notice you have more energy, you're sleeping better. Maybe you are losing weight. Maybe it doesn't make a difference. I do think that this method of eating earlier has a higher potential for weight loss, largely because we tend to make sounder decisions earlier in the day. And in the evening, when we're tired, there's actually a physiologic drive to eat carbohydrates because of the quick energy that they provide. Anyone who's worked night shift can tell you that that's there. And so if we stop our eating window a little bit earlier, we might even just make smarter choices. And so trying to keep that in mind. Again, if you are doing anything like this, always talk with your doctor first. There's concern, especially if you do anything besides the time-restricted feeding, if you have any chronic illnesses. So make sure you talk with your doctor about the safety. There's, again, mixed data about this, and so not all providers have read the data or feel comfortable with it. And so I would encourage you to ask their opinion, but then also do some reading on your own and experiment. This is a completely free approach to improve your health. So as long as your doctor tells you it's safe, there's really no risk to you, and it's just a way to try it out and see if it works for you. And then we really want to end this presentation with action steps. And so I want you to there are a few cues you can think about, but is your diet sad? Do you feel that you're eating the standard American diet? Sometimes a sad diet still can look kind of healthy, right? It could be a bowl of cereal in the morning. It could be a protein bar for a snack, a turkey sandwich with cheese and white bread, followed by some sort of maybe some fruit and maybe some crackers or cookies. And then your dinner could be, roast beef with mashed potatoes and gravy and green beans. And in your mind, that seems like it could be a healthy, balanced diet, but there's not a lot of color in there. And it would still be classified as a standard American diet. So trying to look at reflecting, what does my diet look like and how many plants am I including in my diet? Then evaluating your current diet and how many colors do you eat a day. Like I mentioned, that diet is pretty white and brown. There was an apple that probably had some color and some green beans that had some color, but everything else was kind of white and brown. So seeing if you're able to do that. And then eat one new color a day or try one new food a week. Challenge yourself to step outside your comfort zone. And then I'd encourage you to make a SMART goal about what you reflect on. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.